didn't want to do that.
Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education at Emory's Michael C. Carlos Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's program, held in conjunction with the exhibition Wondrous Worlds, Art and Islam Through Time and Place. One of the great joys of this exhibition has been the opportunity to work across the campus with wonderful Emory faculty members who are so generous with their time and their expertise. And certainly no one has been more wonderful a guide and a friend than Dr. Elizabeth Paston, Professor of Art History. She is a distinguished medievalist specializing in stained glass, among other things, and she just wrote a fabulous book on the Bayeux Tapestry. But her secondary area of interest and research, and she would not say expertise, but I might, is Islamic art. And she is teaching a course this semester around the exhibition, and she has graciously agreed to introduce her friend and our speaker tonight. So it's my great pleasure to turn over the podium to Dr. Elizabeth Paston. Please put your questions in the Q&A function tonight, and we will I will ask those at the end of the program, and Dr. Ruggles will answer them live. So thank you very much for being with us, and thank you, Dr. Paston.
All right then. Thank you, Elizabeth H. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. D. Fairchild Ruggles, a groundbreaking and original scholar who delighted the packed crowd of Carlos Hall listeners when she spoke at Emory in pre-pandemic times a few years ago. I'm pleased to report that the work she presented at that time, which you see on the screen before you, Tree of Pearls, the extraordinary architectural patronage of the 13th century Egyptian slave queen Shahar al-Dur, has now been published by Oxford University Press to great acclaim. As Ruggles noted, of its original or unusual subject matter involving the innovative commissions overseen by the Queen, we need stories about the reality of the Islamic world. There is so much misperception in the West and in the Islamic world about what people could and could not do and how they lived their lives. I think it's really important to counter that with real stories about real people. Dr. Ruggles is professor and the Debra Mitchell Chair in Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with additional appointments in art history, architecture, medieval studies, Spanish and Portuguese studies, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Gender and Women's Studies. Dr. Ruggles has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. I will also add the intriguing note that she is an associate of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Something of the richness and range of Dr. Ruggles' scholarship is attested by some of her other award-winning publications. Her first book, which you see before you, Gardens, Landscape, and Visions in the Palaces of Islamic Spain, surprised and delighted me with its scope, extending over 7 centuries in Spain, from the late Roman Visigothic period into the twilight of Muslim rule that oversaw the building of the Alhambra Palace and Gardens, pictured on her cover here. Her grasp of environmental history is commanding, particularly in her documentation of how the new Umayyad occupants of the Iberian Peninsula consciously remade their physical environment. Ruggles opens up an entirely new space for the consideration of gardens, precisely because Al-Andalus was such a different terrain than the Western Asian landscape its new Muslim occupants had left. The Spanish Umayyads made a serious commitment to the science of agronomy, including crop rotation, fertilization, grafting, irrigation, and the production of agricultural manuals. Her scholarship abounds in such practical insights, yet she also explores how the cultivation of the landscape finds a counterpart in poetic visions of pleasure and repose, as well as imagery where the landscape setting matters, such as the love story shown here, where the wounded heroine, Riyadh, her hand balancing on a trellis plant, seeks solace in the garden pond with gleaming water spouts in the form of horse heads. Indeed, Ruggles is a scholar for whom interdisciplinarity is as essential as a good hydraulic system. In addition, Dr. Ruggles has authored, edited, or co-edited at least 12 other volumes on Islamic art, cultural heritage, landscape history and theory, and the arts patronage of women in the Islamic world, including the indispensable anthology of primary sources shown here. Her prize-winning Islamic Gardens and Landscapes from 2008 has been translated into both Turkish and Japanese. In June of last year, her essay, Venturing into the Sonic Realm, Listening to Islamic Gardens and Landscapes, was awarded one of the two 2020 essay prizes by the Landscape History chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. As the committee commented of her work, written in compelling, elegant, and accessible prose, Ruggles uses disparate lines of evidence to interrogate the sensory relationship between Islamic society and nature, writing from a trans-regional scope and framed against the historiographic backdrop of art historical approaches to the senses. Ruggles explores the embodied sensory experience of landscape in ways that revisit classic approaches to perception, representation, and subjectivity. In doing so, she probes the cultural significance of these spaces and pushes beyond visually privileged epistemologies that anchor visual culture studies. Ruggles weaves together close readings of poetry, murals, sculpture, and illustrated manuscripts, demonstrating that the potential of phenomenological inquiries into long dormant and destroyed gardens to recapture the experience of the sensate body. In closing, I would like to gesture briefly beyond her scholarly publications. Dr. Ruggles has served as chair of the doctoral program in architecture and landscape architecture at Illinois so frequently that it's beginning to look like a lifetime appointment. And her scholarly interests have also led her to design innovative courses, such as the one on the environmental history of water, which she has elsewhere described as the conceptual underpinning of the garden. As she states in her course description, and I quote, I am particularly fascinated by the past and present interconnections between human society and water management, both the failures and the successes. And my research in that area led me to develop an undergraduate environmental history course on water from ancient Pompeii to the Ganges to 20th century Chicago. Tonight, we are going to hear her speak about reflections of the past in modern Islamic gardens in conjunction with the verdant imagery of the Wondrous Worlds exhibit. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruggles.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a very beautiful introduction. I appreciate it. Let me do share screen, and then I have some other things I want to say. Can you see the screen that I'm showing now? Okay, great. Well, I want to say it's a pleasure, and I want to say to be here this evening, but I don't really know where any of us are. But I want to thank Elizabeth Horner, and I want to thank Maria Carrion for including me in this speaker series, and to again reiterate that this is not my first visit to Emory. I was lucky enough to come for a live visit 2 years ago at the invitation of Elizabeth Pastan. And I have to say, I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the campus. I think the azaleas might have been in bloom, and everywhere I turned, there was just this luminous color. I just want to say, I wish I was there in person with you now. And when we think about where we are, and when we think about culture, I also beg your patience as I preface my talk with what has become a standard university statement about Indigenous culture that my university has adopted as standard practice. So with that, I'll just say that I recognize and acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois, from where I'm speaking now, has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of the university for the past 150 years. Okay, thank you for letting me say that. So now what I'm going to do is to talk about water and design in modern Islamic gardens built around the world. But to do that, I also want to introduce you to some of the more important historic gardens from that long tradition. And the history is important for several reasons. First, from that long and diverse history come the forms, the technologies, values, and meanings of the contemporary gardens that we enjoy today. Although, as we'll see, they're not exactly the same, but there is this sense of a legacy. By the way, we're looking on the screen right now at Azhar Park, built in Cairo, finished in the year 2005, a really glorious example of the best of modern Islamic gardens, in my opinion. And the reason, so we're going to look at this section right here, a little close up. The reason that Azhar Park in Cairo looks the way it does is in part because of all the older gardens and landscapes that have preceded it. Indeed, Azhar Park is deliberate in the way that it selects elements from history, such as in this case, the use of stepped terracing. So by that, I mean the way this water flows from one level or terrace, we sometimes call it, to the next, and it's flanked by a kind of parallel pedestrian movement. So this is something we see in the past, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. And it's something that then gets redeployed in the present. It doesn't look quite the same as it does in the past, but that basic idea of making water the central actor in a landscape drama is very much the same. Secondly, one of the most influential contemporary patrons of modern Islamic garden design is the Agakon, through the Agakon Trust for Culture. The Agakon cares deeply about history and has supported the excavation and restoration of several historic gardens, notably the tomb of the Mughal Emperor Humayun in New Delhi, and you see that on the screen here. And the foundation has also run design competitions and funded the creation of entirely new gardens, such as Azhar Park, which we just looked at. And also a large garden outside of Edmonton in northwestern Canada, which you see on the screen here. This is just a very small part of that garden. It's really enormous, and it has a lot of qualities that seem very Mughal to me, and you may see that in some of the sites that I'm going to show you. You'll also see that this idea of a stellar-shaped pool comes up again and again, both in historic gardens, but also modern gardens. And here's one of those water chutes that we just looked at, with water coming down from one level to the next. The foundation, did I say that? Yes. And the other thing I want to show you is several courtyard gardens at the Agakon Center at King's Cross, London. These are actually quite new. And typically, after selecting the architect, and it's usually done through a competition, so after the Agakon has selected the architect for each of these new designs, he typically will send that designer on a tour of historic gardens. It's like a kind of mini postgraduate education that he insists on. So when the Lebanese landscape architect Vladimir Jurovich was sent on such a tour just after winning the commission for the gardens at the new Agakon Museum and Ismaili Center in Toronto, he was sent on such a tour. In an interview with me just before the gardens were completed, he recalled the impact that the tour had on him. And he's a designer for whom water has always been an important element. But on seeing the Alhambra's Court of the Myrtles in Granada, he became even more sensitive to the role of water as a liquid thing that is utterly unlike other architectural elements. The water fills whatever shape contains it. So here we're looking at a rectangular tank of water, but we could also look at either end of that tank and notice how here the water takes on a circular form because of course it's contained by a circular basin. The water reflects the walls of the courtyard that contain it, doubling the effect of the architecture. And there's something absolutely magical about this. And every time I step into this courtyard, I notice it, and most people do notice it, which is that we have, all around us, we have architecture that we think of as this stable, it's made of stone, it lasts through time, it's this really solid substance. And yet half of the architecture that we see in this courtyard is actually just light reflecting off the surface of the water. It's not there at all. It's not stable. It's in fact ephemeral. Of that experience with the immateriality of water, Jurovich said that everything dissolves. So he was very deeply impressed by this. And so we see that reflected in the reflective surface of the large water pool that he designed for the Agakon Museum in Toronto in 2008. And you're looking at that here. And what I want you to notice is that although this may seem like a very highly polished slab of black stone, it's actually coated with a thin film of water. And that water is, just as it was in the Alhambra, it is reflecting the architectural and landscape elements around it. So it's performing that task of both dematerializing, but also doubling the effect of its environment. Jurovich also visited the Tomb of Humayun and said that he was impressed with the idea of a garden as something that can last through time. Now, we typically think about gardens as ephemeral effects. We think about the all too brief blooming of flowers and the way that sunlight illuminates colors. These are sort of momentary effects. Also, as we just noted, the textured effect of a rippling water surface. But this is a tomb meant to last for centuries as a standing memorial to a deceased sovereign. Jurovich was impressed by this and said that it taught him, and I quote, that we are not only building for now, but also for the generations of the future. So this evening, I want us to think about time and the garden, about the past, and how it can inspire new work in the present, recognizing that the gardens made in the present will someday be those historic works from which future designers seek inspiration. So to set the stage, let's look at some of the great Islamic gardens of the past to see where the Aga Khan was sending his landscape architects. Specifically, Humayun's tomb, which you see at the top of the screen and which I've already showed you. And on the bottom, the Alhambra and Generalife palaces in Granada, Spain. These date to the 13th, but really most of what we see belongs to the 14th century. Now, at the Alhambra, we've already just seen the Court of the Myrtles, but adjacent to this courtyard with its great tank of silvery water is the Court of the Lions. The Court of the Lions was divided into 4 quarters by water channels that cross the floor of the courtyard. So you're looking at those water channels here, and from this more aerial view drawing, you can see how the space is divided up. A fountain stands at the point where these water channels intersect at the center of the courtyard. The courtyard was originally planted as a garden, or at least it had some orange trees, but the current administration of the Alhambra has paved the floor of the courtyard. And there is some dispute currently about the original character of the vegetation. So here you can see all this white marble paving. And if any of you in the audience have been to the Alhambra recently, you know that in the hot summer day, that white marble is blindingly hot and blindingly bright. It is not a successful solution. But the problem is we don't really know how the courtyard was originally planted. We have photographs from the 1960s, relatively recent in the building's history, that show it gardened in a way that was utterly inauthentic, right? It looks like my backyard there. And then we have prints from the 19th century, and actually we have prints that date earlier than that. We have prints going back to the 17th century that show it either paved or with plants. So this is for those people who follow drama at the Alhambra Palace. This is what everyone is arguing about these days. But the one thing that's not in dispute, that no one argues about, is that quadripartite plan. The plan, called a chaharbagh, meaning 4-part garden, is deeply meaningful in the Islamic world. It represents the way that the agricultural landscape was divided into manageable plots for irrigation. And let's remember that the early Islamic world was an agricultural economy. I'm talking about the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. And so when we look at something as simple as this farm with its plots of land that's been tended by some farmer, we can see that without any intention to serve as a designer or to beautify the space, that farmer has divided the space into a grid, using the axes to define the land and also to define plots into which water will be introduced so that it can percolate down, sink down into the soil. This is called flood irrigation. So we see it here in farmland. We even see it in an oasis out in the desert. This is one of a series of magnificent photographs taken by a photographer who I think was floating in a hot air balloon when he took them. Anyway, he's looking down here on an oasis, and even here in a place in which hardly anyone is even going to see this place. It's not meant to impress visitors or to look like a formal garden. Even here, the farmer has divided up the land into a rough grid. So this is the thing that the 4-part garden evokes. And of course, as many of you will know, the garden also eventually developed as a symbol of the paradise awaiting the faithful, as described in the Quran. And I'll just read the verse to you. I'm sure it's familiar to many. This is the paradise which the righteous have been promised. There shall flow in it rivers of unpolluted water and rivers of milk forever fresh, rivers of delectable wine and rivers of clearest honey. They shall eat therein of every fruit and receive forgiveness from their Lord. So that is a well-known example of meaning and how a garden accrues meaning through its relation to that very key text in Islam. But at the Alhambra, the fountain itself was also symbolic. It stands at the center of the garden, drawing attention to the role of water as the life force that makes gardening possible in the dry climate of southern Spain. And let's remember that it's not only southern Spain, it's all the way across northern Africa and into the Middle East and beyond. There is this kind of band of climate that is remarkably similar, with mild winters and hot, dry summers. Made it possible for plants to move easily from one area of the Islamic world to the other because the climate was so similar. So what we're looking at here symbolically is the way that these channels not only intersect, but meet in the center of the garden. And if the garden fountain were functioning, it would be it would have water here. It used to throw water up in the air, but that was a long time ago. And then it spews, the actual lion figures spew the water out of their mouths. So it's a very kind of dynamic, animated feature in that garden. And in this, the fountain is both mimicking and symbolizing the flow of water in channels across the surface of the earth in agricultural settings, as we see here. And the jets that send water upwards, so there's a little jet, you can just see a little bit of it, and out the lion's mouths. These jets symbolize the emergence of water from the earth in natural springs and wells. So here, what we're seeing is something that represents something like this on the left, where you see a well out in the landscape in the upper left. You see water being drawn up by a water wheel in the lower left. And on the right, you have two of the more kind of, they've been transformed into aesthetic devices. Here at the Alhambra, this is the fountain that we're looking at. And I love showing this one because this is just really a simple spigot. But the spigot has been ornamented by turning the handle into a peacock. So in order to turn the water on and off, you have to rotate the body of the peacock. And of course, the peacock is an animal, a bird, that would stroll about these early gardens. They still do. So my point here is that water, when it enters into an environment such as a palace, is a spectacular moment. It's the moment in which vegetation is possible, in which human life is possible. And so what we're seeing is a translation of the ordinary into the extraordinary and beautiful. Now, if we return to the Tomb of Humayun, we see the same four-part garden plan. Only here, instead of a water fountain at the center, it is the mausoleum that stands at the center. The cenotaphs of the emperor and eventually the family members who joined him there sit in the tomb's central chamber, below the great white dome that floats high above like a cloud. This mausoleum is where annually family and court would come to pay respects to the deceased emperor. In this sense, the tomb was a meeting place, not only of these axes, but it's a meeting place between the deceased and the living. It is the conceptual point of intersection that unites earthly garden with heavenly paradise, the horizontal plane of the earth connecting to the vertical axis to eternity. If the Alhambra's Court of the Lions is an agricultural metaphor, the Tomb of Humayun is clearly a paradisiac metaphor. Now, in turning from these to look at more contemporary gardens and landscapes, I want to ask you to pay attention to how each one uses the past, variously as an inspiration and as a source for rediscovering garden forms. As we look at the new gardens and recognize the adaptation of historic forms in them, we also want to ask how those gardens and garden elements have come to mean something different in the present. Now, we already know that Humayun's tomb was a mausoleum built to house the body of the Mughal emperor, a place for his descendants to pay their respects, and in so doing, to call attention to the way that genealogy, traced through him, gave them the authority to rule India. The tomb and its garden had a clear religious function, but also a clear political function. But when the campaign to restore and preserve the tomb was concluded some 10 years ago, it was no longer a place for the Mughal elite. They were long gone, they died out. Instead, it had become a place where ordinary families and visitors would go to marvel at the grandeur of the historic architecture and to enjoy an afternoon in the well-tended gardens. And I just draw your attention, I've deliberately chosen this photograph that is chock full of people and families. Here's a group of 4 about to have their picture taken in front of one of those pools with a dynamic jet. And you can just see there's lots of people wandering around admiring the building. In other words, at this point in time, this mausoleum garden had become a public park, which is a very different kind of meaning. The 4-part garden and great domed tomb are the same in terms of their material form. So nothing's changed. It might have been cleaned up a little bit, but that's all. But they are now invested with very different meanings. Instead of representing imperial power and dynasty, the tomb and its park-like setting now represents India's modern democratic values because it's open to anyone. Meaning changes dramatically when forms that were made for one set of patrons, such as the Mughal emperors, are suddenly claimed by a different set of patrons, the democratic state of India. This kind of shift can be especially noticeable in periods of colonization. We can see colonialism at work in the so-called Mughal Gardens of the Rashtrapati Bhavan in Delhi. The grand residence was built to serve as the British Viceroy's house at the beginning of the 20th century in the colonial era. But it is now the home of the Indian president. It is set off from the city by 250 acres of ground. And so just to pause for a moment, this is the building. It has a lot of Indian elements, also a lot of classical elements like that colonnade. And this is where it's set. This is the residence itself. There are various parliamentary buildings in front of it, but I draw your attention to this enormous amount of land that surrounds it, 250 acres. And that enclosure was almost surely designed to protect the British Viceroy from colonial subjects rebelling against British rule, as had happened earlier in British colonial Indian history. Now we're going to focus on the back side of the residence. So here we're looking at the front side, but we're going to actually turn and look at the garden, just this small area here on the back side. There is a 15-acre formal garden. And there's plenty to say about the palace and all of its gardens, but this evening I'm just going to focus with you on this Mughal garden. The garden was a modern interpretation of a classic Mughal Chaharbagh. It used sandstone paving strips, as you see here, and water channels to divide the garden into 4 parts. And to make that evident to you, I'm showing you the division into 4 parts, but also that because it is such an enormous space, that those 4 quadrants were themselves then subdivided. Get my mouse to work, subdivided as you see here. And we saw something similar in the Tomb of Humayun, although I didn't point it out at the time. There are many references to South Asian history in the garden, from the lotus pad fountain, as you see on the upper right, to the stepped edges of the water channels and the locally quarried and distinctive red sandstone that was the primary building material. But one element that is markedly different from any historical Mughal precedent is that square area of turf at the garden center. In an Islamic garden, we might expect to see a water fountain at the center of the garden, again, marking that exciting and deeply meaningful moment when water, life-sustaining water, enters into the garden and launches that agricultural metaphor about organizing and irrigating the earth. And we saw that play out at the Alhambra. Or in a commemorative garden, we'd expect to see the mausoleum at the center of the garden, where those principal axes of the Chaharbagh intersect, symbolically marking the point of transition between life and death. And we saw this paradisiac metaphor at Humayun's tomb. But here at the British Viceroy's house, the space is taken up by a square of lawn, the quintessential symbol of British landscape. Lawn grass grows well in England, where the weather is cool and damp, but it does not grow naturally in India. It is an imported form, as foreign to Delhi as the British themselves. The green square does not mark the moment when water enters into the garden, nor does it mark a transition from life to death. This square of lawn was used for government receptions, which is to say, cocktail parties. The form is the same, the cross-axial chaharbagh, but the meaning of it has changed profoundly. Now, I teach this monument in my classes. I teach it at the end of the semester because as you'll know from this lecture, I really believe in teaching a history that leads us to the present. And so after explaining this site to my university students, I often ask them, is this an Islamic garden? Is it an Indian garden? Or could we call it a British garden? And we usually have a lively debate as we consider the way that the built environment can express religious, cultural, or national identity. The Viceroy's house in Delhi is an example of a garden whose meaning has changed due to the context of colonialism. Another force that leads to the adaptation of historic Islamic garden forms for new patrons and new meanings is globalism. In Honolulu, the fabulously wealthy American heiress Doris Duke built a beautiful vacation home in 1937-38. And to the oceanside estate, she brought objects that she had collected from her travels in Iran, Syria, Egypt, and India. And here we are looking at her main living room, and I want to point out some of the things there because these are all things that she had collected. So in these shelves here and here is a rather nice ceramic collection. And if we look through these doors, these wooden panel doors, we are actually looking at a ceramic piece that is a mihrab that had been removed from a mosque in Iran. And I don't know the circumstances by which it was removed, but I can tell you that it is a close sibling. It is very closely related to a similar Persian mihrab that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has, and it is one of their prized possessions. We can also look at the woodwork. We can look at glass. We can look at this trunk. We can look at this stool, this brass tray. This looks like a little Moroccan table. This kind of coffered ceiling is something that comes from either Spain or Morocco. You can see the kind of eclecticism of her taste and how it all comes together in this setting. It's a very, today we would call it a very Orientalist interior. And we can also see that it was not only the interior of the house, but also the gardens that were designed to echo the Islamic architecture and gardens that she had seen and admired in her extensive travels. To understand the gardens made for Shangri-La, however, we should first look at the precedents that inspired them. And one of them is the Nishatbag, one of the many pleasure gardens built in the Himalaya mountains of Kashmir by the Mughal emperors and their extended family in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Nishatbag was designed as a series of 12 stepped levels, the number 12 being a clear reference to the zodiac. These descend from the base of a mountain, as you see on the left, down to a lake, as you see on the right. So in these pictures, you can imagine me standing there facing the mountains in one direction and then turning in the other to face the lake. I should tell you also, I have the, the shame or the distinction of being one of the few people I know to ever go to Kashmir in December. And in December, it is cold and it is snowy and none of the plants are blooming. And the only thing I was able to go, it was a moment when I could actually get there, which is not always true, unfortunately. But one of the good things about it is that it allowed me to see these sites without the clutter of flowers, which are so distracting. And I was able to kind of see the bones of the garden. And what I just want you to notice is what looks empty here is in fact meant to be a water channel. And when it's in season, it looks more like this. As the water cascades from one level to the next, as you can see here, it pours over panels of ornamental niches called chinihana. You see a detail of that on the right. And I'm going to show you a better example without the water in the way here. So this is, of course, a very sad looking picture because the water is not in the pool and the jets are not throwing water up in the air, but I show it to you so that you can see that this is where the water would flow from. Here's a level of the garden. There's someone standing up there. It would flow over that point, over this panel of niches into this channel here, filling the basin and then moving on down along its path. And what's really wonderful about these chinikhana niches, and some of you have probably seen this, had the pleasure of seeing it, is that they can either be fitted with little oil lamps that illuminate the water from behind so that the water has this kind of prismatic effect. And this is one of the Agakon gardens in Edmonton, I think, is where this one comes from. Or you can put bright colored flowers, often they're marigolds, because there's so many marigolds in India. One can put bright colored flowers behind there. And again, you're looking through the water at something that starts to look like emeralds and rubies. It's a really, really magical effect. We find an echo of the Nishatbag in Honolulu, in the gardens of Shangri-La. The main lawn consists of a stepped landscape, as we saw at Nishatbag, with a central channel of water leading to, in this case, not a lake, but a swimming pool. And it's a rather famous swimming pool because it has this dive board that is actually a hydraulic lift that rises out of the pavement and goes high up in the air, so you can do high dives from this, this diving board. Elsewhere at the estate, the so-called Mughal Garden has one long central axis with a water channel lined with dynamic jets. The water enters into the channel, pouring over a panel of chinikhana, as we saw at the Nishatbag. The inspiration for these elements clearly comes from Mughal India and also to some extent Iran. Interesting to note here that instead of red sandstone, the architects adapted by using red brick, which was more readily available, although not as durable as stone. And I'm showing you here an early photograph of the site before it was restored, when it became a monument after the death of the patron. There was a period of restoration that the site had to go through, and I saw it in that period. And I have to say, it's rather sad to see this surface looking so pockmarked. But if you go there today, and I highly recommend it, you will see a much better tended garden and the brick has been fully restored. Now, because of the patron's immense wealth, she was able to travel around the globe by ship and by airplane, collecting ideas for her Honolulu paradise, as well as actual objects, such as the stuff that we saw in her living room, but also here you can see hanging mosque lamps and these glorious Persian tiles, some of which were commissioned and some of which are actually 19th century tile that she collected. Also, she bought carved marble screens from artisans in India. I think she bought them from Agra. So this is a living tradition that she was stimulating in her purchase of these carved screens. Now there's an interesting story about these screens because when they arrived, they're fabulously expensive. When they arrived, several of them were broken. And so rather than throw them out, because who could do that? She put the broken ones, she pieced together the broken ones and put them on the roof of her residence. And this is a kind of solarium that she created up there. And then she ordered an entirely new set of screens and installed them where they were always meant to go, around the windows and doorways of the residential rooms below this. She was copying, in commissioning these screens, she was copying what she had seen in India and Iran, such as the ornamental panels surrounding the shrine at Fatehpur Sikri in India. This is to say, she wasn't only collecting things that appeal to her, she also commissioned new work in the form of the gardens, the marble screens, the chinikhana, this star-shaped pool, and the mirror-encrusted columns that you see in this, which is called the Persian courtyard. Doris Duke was an eclectic consumer of cultures that were not her own. And it was her globe-trotting travels that made that possible. Now, returning to the question that I had asked earlier, can we really call this a Mughal garden, given that it was made in Hawaii by American architects for an American patron? I'm not sure of the answer to that. The opposite approach to history was taken in the new mosque built in Granada in 2003, where the connection to the past was deeply meaningful. It had a lot to do with the identity of the people in this mosque. This modern mosque looks back to Granada's own Islamic history and quotes liberally from it. But it is a complicated history because although Granada was the home of Nasrid sultans who lived in the Alhambra Palace, the city was conquered by the Christian kingdoms of the north in 1492. In an attempt to thoroughly Christianize the Iberian Peninsula, and it was a form of crusade, the Spanish kings expelled first the Jews and then the remaining Muslims. Thus, the Alhambra became the property of the Spanish, which is to say Christian crown. But when Spain entered the EU in 1986, so fast forward through time, its economy began to grow rapidly and it attracted immigrants, many being Muslims from Northern Africa. They began moving to Spain, specifically to Granada, to open small businesses, especially craft stores and tea shops, such as you see here. It's interesting, a lot of people go to Granada and they see this wonderful kind of, it's like a souk or a bazaar, and it just feels very, North African, but it is very new. If you went there 25 years ago, none of these shops were there. But in any case, by the 1990s, Granada's population of Muslim immigrants and converts, also converts, had grown large, and they needed a new mosque. The mosque that was built stands atop a high hill from where its walled terrace looks across to the Alhambra. And I want you to see that there is a kind of conversation between the new mosque and the old Alhambra there. There are clear references to Islamic design in the garden, where we see colorful tile cut into geometric patterns and ornamental fountains set within that star shape that I've pointed out to you several times now, with water jets that bring dynamism into the space. We see precedents for this in the Alhambra, a historic tradition, and in Morocco, a living tradition, where artisans still practice the craft of geometrical tile work. And on the left here, I'll show you a detail of it. I'm showing you a particularly fine 19th century example. I really love this place. I try and find an excuse to insert it into every lecture that I give because I'm just in love with the geometry of that floor. This deliberate reference to older architectural forms is intentional at the mosque, which uses the references to suggest a continuity that was in fact ruptured in 1492. Even the setting and the view from the garden suggests cultural continuity. In its view across a deep valley toward the Alhambra, it is as though past and present were gazing upon each other. Now, we've already seen the Azhar Park in Cairo, and you're looking at it from an aerial perspective here, but it merits a closer look because of its immense size and complexity. In the dense, congested city of Cairo, where there are few gardens and few parks, the Agakon Trust for Culture began constructing a major public park in the 1990s, and it wasn't finished until 2005. And the chosen site was challenging. It was an immense pile of rubble dating back to the 12th century, which required archaeological attention before the land could be cleared and prepared for the park. So interestingly, the engagement with history in this case was quite literal in the form of architectural material from 800 years ago. This was also a poor neighborhood of Cairo, so the plan included social welfare projects, job creation, and urban renewal. The park expressed modern and progressive social values, and yet it was clearly tied to the past and was inspired by the Islamic garden and architectural tradition. It is geometrically organized around a firm axis at the center of the plan, and you're looking down that axis. You've actually walked in from the right through the portal, and then you've turned right, and now you're looking down that axis in one direction. And again, if you were to turn around and look in the other way, you'd see a continuation of the axis in the other direction. The axis is articulated by a central channel of water, flanked by a very broad paved walkway. And the site is so large that this walkway converts. So that walkway that we just looked at is this walkway that you see. I'm pointing with my finger, which you can't see. I'll use my pointer. Is this channel here, which because of the enormity of the site, it actually converts to a more narrow channel as it continues along. Notice that the land here slopes slightly, and we've seen this kind of sloping site or terraced site in earlier Islamic gardens, and you can see terracing here. And of course, we saw it earlier when we were looking at this area here. One thing I want to point out to you is this central water channel, which has become quite narrow here. As it goes from one level to the next, corresponding with these steps, it falls over a tiny little cascade. So an effect that we saw large scale at Nishatbag is echoed here, but now the architect is kind of playing with it and playing particularly with the scale of it. Notice also the double row of palm trees. They give the sense that we are walking along an arcade of columns. The park also has fountains, and here's that entrance. There's the plaza that we're looking at here, looking in one direction. That was the axis that we look as we go up here, but we could also turn around, and here's the rest of the axis as it reaches the other end of its destiny. So there are two fountains here. One is a very modern surface fountain with 25 vertical jets that throws water up in the air. And of course, you can imagine, Cairo is a pretty hot city. Kids love this because the first thing they want to do is throw themselves into the water, which they are allowed to do. And there are also more traditional fountains set within water basins and fed by surface channels in much the same way as we saw at the Alhambra. At either end of the long central axis is a restaurant, and at the other end, a cafe. What I hope you're noticing here is that although traditional elements have been used in the design, the purpose of the space as a whole is quite different from anything in the past. Instead of a palace garden made for the court or an elite family, this satisfies the need in Cairo for public space and a place where ordinary families, couples, individuals, and visitors can gather to enjoy nature and fresh air together. Like the Tomb of Humayun, this satisfies the modern expectation of amenities for ordinary people, which includes you and me. But unlike the Tomb of Humayun, this park was built entirely of new materials, but shaped in such a way as to reflect history. For my last example, I show you a very different kind of history tapped for a new mosque built outside of Istanbul. Instead of referring to the Islamic tradition of the geometrical chaharbagh, using chinikhana niches, fountains, and water cascading from one terrace to the next, the architect of the Sun Çaklar Mosque in Istanbul invites a very different kind of experience. The architect stated that he found his inspiration in the cave of Hira, where the Prophet Muhammad received his first revelations. And these are, of course, the revelations that collected would become the Quran. So a very meaningful association. And the mosque, which we could enter if we were going to enter it, which we're not because we're studying the landscape, but if we were to enter it, we would see that it is indeed cave-like. But the landscape evokes a very different kind of past. It echoes the ruined Greek and Roman amphitheaters that can be found throughout Turkey. These are typically built up on one side and open on the other. In other words, they're stages for viewing, which is what their function was. They were theaters. And the Sun Çaklar Mosque likewise is walled on one side to protect it from a busy roadway. That's off to the right in the image that you're looking at. And it forms a kind of stadium approach to the mosque below. In both, the land is shaped by rugged stone blocks wedged into the contour of the slope. Here, the way that history is used is not eclectic so much as fragmented. The classical amphitheater is not reproduced as a whole, but as a ruin, the thing on which later Byzantine and Islamic cultures would be superimposed. So the question I have for you again is whether this is like the Viceroy's Palace in Delhi, as we see on the left, or Shangri-La in Honolulu, cases where historic forms were freely adapted, even though they did not reflect the identity of the patron who sponsored the gardens. Or is it more like the Mosque of Cordoba, where there is a self-conscious display of identity through the use of geometry, colorful tile, and the strategic placement of the mosque, looking out on the Alameda? Or is it more like the Agakon Museum and Ismaili Center in Toronto, which rejects the practice of copying and instead emphasizes abstract concepts such as reflection, dematerialization, and abstract geometry? At the Sancaklar Mosque in Istanbul, is it an Islamic identity that is proclaimed, or a Turkish identity? Or perhaps an ingenious blend of both, the cave of revelation and the historic classical landscape of Anatolia? The overarching question that emerges from this journey through history to the present is how history serves as a resource to be tapped for current and future gardens. Can the landscape architecture of the past serve contemporary identities? When the past is used in these various ways, is it a form of backward-looking nostalgia or forward-looking inspiration? The whole question of identity is a complicated one because objects and buildings and landscapes do not have identities of their own. They are places onto which we project our identities. Remember how we've seen the same form, the Chaharbagh, represent different things depending on who employs it. And these are the questions that I struggle with constantly. I consider all of the gardens that I've showed you this evening to be examples of Islamic gardens, yet they are made under very different conditions. So we can ask, through what medium or form does the Islamic identity of a place resonate? Does identity reside in the designer or the patron or the users, to employ a very modern term? Does it matter whether the designer of an Islamic garden is Muslim or not? Whether that person grew up in Virginia or Egypt? Does it matter whether the patron is the Agakon Trust for Culture or Doris Duke? Does it matter whether a garden is made to be enjoyed by the people of Delhi or Granada or by tourists like me coming from far away? Ultimately, I hope we can avoid assigning cultural positions that result in an us and a them, and instead think of Islamic gardens as a shared, global, immensely beautiful phenomenon that exceeds easy definition. So if there's one point that I hope you'll take from this talk this evening, it's that Islamic garden design is ongoing, and it is innovative, and it is happening in many, many different places. Thank you. Should I stop sharing?
Maybe let's just see, because sometimes people have requests to see images from before.
Sure.
So we have some feedback going on here. Do you hear that?
Yes.
So we do have some questions in the chat already. Thank you so much for that remarkable lecture. I don't know that I've ever wanted to travel so much in my life as I do after seeing that. So first off, Gerald Bird, were the engineers who made the water go where it needed to go so that we could have this sensual, spiritual, living, design savvy art? Were they revered in their time and culture? What of their training?
That's a good
Did
question.
They have licensure?
No. So that's a really good question. And it's interesting that we know far more about the architects and the patrons than we do about the actual artisans and engineers. When they get to the level of the person who applies mortar to brick, we often don't know very much about them. It's something that fascinates me. With water, what we know is that it is a, how do I put this? to make a simple canal is not that complicated. We've all been at the beach or somewhere and pulled a stick through sand and made the water run. But to make it run long distance from a place that is out of sight to another place that is also out of sight requires a kind of knowledge that nowadays we get from our, a GPS or some kind of, satellite positioning or a theodolite or, some complicated machinery that they did not have. So there is an extraordinary expertise at work here. And it is almost entirely based on geometry, the science of geometry, where by triangulation, they could figure out slope and degree of incline, and then they could apply that to an actual landscape setting. The only thing I can add to that is there is a kind of water conduit that runs underground. And some of you may know a qanat, this underground conduit. It's like an aqueduct, but it runs below the surface. The one thing I do know is that the people who made those are typically very well paid because it's dangerous, highly skilled work. And that's because there's been a lot of ethnography, a lot of study of qanats because they're just so fascinating. But beyond that, I don't know much.
And a similar question related to more contemporary engineering. Can you say a bit about the water features at the Ismaili Center in Toronto and how they work, that floating?
Yeah, they're very subtle. It's the same technique that if you've ever been to a swanky hotel that has what's called an infinity pool, where instead of having a rim that holds the water in, can you hear me, Elizabeth? Yeah, okay. Instead of having a rim that holds the water in like a tub, you take the rim away so that the water clings to not only the horizontal surface, but also the vertical surface. So it's not that complicated, but it is magical in that it makes the water disappear into the stone and that you're not even conscious that there's water there, except it also dematerializes the stone so that the stone looks like it's entirely made of water, like two things happening at the same time. You're muted.
Scott Kugel, who's a professor here at Emory, says,
I know Scott.
Is it fair to say that the Mughal royal family died out? Isn't it true that the British colonial occupiers executed most of that family after blinding and exiling to Burma the last emperor?
Yeah, no, it's not a happy story.
Gruesome history.
Yeah, it's not a happy story. I think what I'm saying, though, is that there are no Mughals going to pay respects to Humayun nowadays. The people who go to pay respects to Humayun are tourists and, architects and ordinary people. There is no elite. Technically, the elite is an elected government, with the exception of a few principalities. Yeah. I don't want to get into the gruesomeness of it. This is about gardens, Scott. Let's be nice.
Okay. Another question is, sorry, do you hear this feedback or am I the only one hearing it?
I'm not hearing it.
Excellent. That's great.
Should I put myself on mute while you're reading the question? Would that help?
I don't know. This has never happened before, but I'm not worried about it. Nobody else hears that it's fine. Maria Louisa Mansfield asked, you do hear it?
I do. I wonder if getting out of the PowerPoint would help. Sometimes that
we can always open it up again if we need to. How's that?
Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Okay, another question has to do with President Modi and some of the things that have happened to Islamic, the mosques. And this Maria Mansfield asks if you think that Islamic gardens are safe in India.
I think the religious monuments are hotly contested. It is not a happy history and it flares up periodically, quite violently. I think gardens are less contentious, although of course the Tomb of Humayun is attached to a tomb, but it's not a tomb where there's much active religious observance going on. So it's not quite so inflammatory, for want of a better word. I think that if you ask, well, it's complicated. If you ask some people, I'm also getting something through chat now. If you ask many people, they will regard the Mughal past as a shared history. And many people know that it's a period when there's a lot of collaborative nation building on the part of certainly the Rajputs and the Muslim Mughals. And the Mughals, there's even a question as to whether Akbar was really Muslim for part of his life, because he had gone so far in a kind of mystical direction. So I wouldn't say the gardens are actively being destroyed, but what I would say is something slightly different, which is that in the 20th century, with the division of South Asia into 3 nation states, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, you now have a heritage that is not fully overseen by one body, in that if you're Pakistani, part of your Mughal heritage is in a country for which you need a visa and where you may not be able to get a research visa to go study it. And I see this with graduate students all the time who, if you're an American, it's easier to get to all 3 places. But if you come from one of those countries, to go study the other fragment of that Mughal history in that setting can be quite difficult. It can be emotionally difficult, and it can be just legalistically difficult to get the visa. So it's a complicated question with a lot of sadness embedded in it.
So I will try one more time with a question. Now I don't hear feedback. I don't know what happened. I didn't do anything
when I
different.
mute myself, you might not hear the feedback. I think I'm due for a new laptop. This is what I think.
Okay, so this is a question that's come up several times in the lectures having to do with water. And I know you mentioned the quote from the Quran at the beginning, but people are curious about the religious symbolism of the water itself in Islam and things like reflection, the religious symbolism of that. I wonder if you could speak to that.
I'm trying to figure out where to begin.
It's a whole nother lecture, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, water is immensely symbolic, and it's symbolic large. I mean, of course, there's plenty of reference to water in the Quran. God sends down rain from above. So there's that sense of beneficence is imagined as water in some respects. But it's also, in terms of practice, very important, because the way that purity is achieved, and purity is needed before prayer and before certain other acts, purity is required, and to be ritually clean is to bathe oneself with water. And there are ritualistic ways of performing that. So water is important both in terms of what the Quran describes as water doing and what it represents, but also I almost want to say practically in terms of what it achieves for someone about to pray.
Thank you. We also have Roxanne Margariti, who's another Emory scholar who's been such a wonderful colleague throughout this exhibition and is teaching around it. And she says, what a fascinating, beautiful lecture. Thank you. Cultural principles, is there evidence that aquaculture was ever included in the conceptualization of the garden design? She's thinking of fish ponds and fish.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself. Yeah, there. You're muted. Dee Dee, you're muted.
Okay. We have to go away from the Mughals and go to Spain, where Medina Sahra, which is this wonderful palace city built outside of Cordoba that is unfortunately was ruined in the early 11th century. But we know that it had fish ponds stocked with fish. And we know that they fed them bread because we have this, for some weird reason, recorded in a description of the palace. So we know that, that fish are being kept in these environments. And what's interesting about fish is, I'm trying to say this in a polite way, but you can't have fish in an unrefrigerated market area the next day, right? If you're living in Cordoba in the 10th century, the only way you eat fish is if you pulled it out of the river an hour or two ago, right? There's no refrigeration, there's no freezing, and fish stinks really badly after a day in the sun. So to have fish, to eat fish, you had to have a fish pond, pretty much, or you had to go down to the river and fish it out. So we do know something about that. That's all I know, but that's what we know about aquaculture.
Okay, thank you. Couple of more. The Agakon Center, the Agakon Center 6 gardens are an excellent study on how many diverse elements of Islamic gardens can come together and be harmonized by key design principles. Each of the gardens have imported materials from different origins. How do you think the materials used to create or recreate gardens affect the integrity of that garden space? For example, how the bricks were substituted for red sandstone. And does that swap affect whether or not the garden is, quote, Islamic or not?
Well, I don't think it matters much. And the reason is that I don't know if you've ever seen the modern mosque in the Upper East Side of New York, but that is a steel beam, plate glass construction. Many mosques use technology. They have, umbrellas that open and close to create shade in the courtyard. There's no reason why a tradition as vibrant as the tradition of making Islamic gardens would limit itself to old materials when we have all these new ways of making fabulous buildings and fabulous gardens. So while there is a time for maintaining traditions, and an example of that would be the Alhambra, where the gardens are still irrigated through flood irrigation because they're conscious of the continuity with in other words, the practice of gardening is as much a part of the history of the site as those gardens themselves. And so they continue to practice in a relatively correct manner. But if I were building a garden today, I would want to use everything at my disposal. I wouldn't limit myself to historic materials. What I would say also is that materials often require a particular artisanal expertise, and we don't always have that anymore. So, for example, when I showed the Granada Mosque, the one that looks across at the Alhambra, and then I showed you the tile fountain. Well, the people who make that, you have to still have that tradition. You have to still know how to make that kind of cut tile. Or what's another example of that? Making a jali screen, that white screen that Doris Duke ordered from Agra. Not that many people are ordering jali screens these days because they're very expensive and they're very hard to make. So it's a dying tradition. And certainly, although they might still know how to drill through the marble, they have lost the ability to invent new patterns. This has actually been very well studied by a colleague of mine in Delhi. So, material goes hand in hand with the ability to work that material. It's not as simple as just, saying, I'm going to make it out of X. So I'm very at home or at ease with the idea of substituting new materials where necessary. I don't think we want to make new stuff out of the old. I think what we want to do is reflect upon the old and ask what the impact could be. And Vladimir Jirovich, the guy working in Toronto, is a perfect example of that. Those gardens look completely modern and contemporary, but he's steeped in a tradition, but he's not locked into it. I mean, I would say the Granada Mosque in some ways is a little, how do I say it politely? It's a little bit of a copy, right? It's derivative. Whereas I would say the Toronto Mosque is excitingly different and new because it dares to use different materials and different techniques.
And the prayer hall is the same way. I mean, the way the dome of the prayer hall is the frosted glass and it changes with the day, the light of the day, and the maple used and the white onyx at the mihrab. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Well, I hope that you can see all of the applause and thanks for such a spectacular lecture in the chat. This was just absolutely marvelous. There's Elizabeth. So thank you so very much for making time and for being with us tonight and taking us on this grand adventure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all your questions, and I really appreciated it. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
And thanks to all of you for coming. And this lecture will be up on the Carlos Museum website next week. So thank you very much. I know you'll want to watch it again. Good night.
Good night.